the Brave browser went white, and then my entire computer shut down, like somebody was attacking it.
Crazy.
But
They finally found you.
Yeah. Yeah. But I was able to reboot the computer, and then finally the Brave browser still didn't want to work, but I shut them all down and then brought one back up and was able to get back onto the live stream to close it because it was still going. But anyway, whatever.
We just roll with it.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, the whole world's going crazy right now. Remind me at the end to talk about some of the posts that were going on today. Bridget, if you wouldn't mind. We're going to get started on, it's called Whitelist. And I may, in order to make sure that we get done with this book before I leave next week, I'm pretty sure we'll get done. So anyway, all right. This chapter starts with if Operation Sunrise and the collusion over the port city in Italy demonstrated the political factors that favored fugitive war criminals, Alan Dulles' new assignment in Berlin was to exemplify some economic characteristics of the same problem. Dulles became one of Robert Murphy's most strategically placed allies inside occupied Germany. Beginning in early 1945, Dulles provided clearances for senior German bankers and industrialists seeking permission to remain active in Germany's post-war economy. Now, keep in mind, these are the same bankers and industrialists that him and his brother did deals with. As an OSS chief in occupied Berlin, he personally oversaw the compilation of what was referred to as whitelist of non-Nazi German executives believed to be useful in German reconstruction. He thus exercised considerable influence during the early months of who got to do business and who didn't. And you can imagine who got to do business and who didn't. The people that had played along with the Dulles brothers all got to do business. If he wanted to take out any of their competition, this is how he did it. Dulles usually favored amnesty for those whose class or economic status made them useful. Not useful to us, useful to them. And for people who had assisted him in intelligence gathering or covert operations. This is the beginning of the Gladio Network. Culpability for Nazi crimes should be limited in most cases to German leaders who remained diehard Nazi enthusiasts. Well, of course, none of these guys did because the Nazis lost. In a striking memo to Washington in late 1944, Dulles erroneously reported that, with a few notable exceptions, Berlin banking circles secretly were violently anti-Nazi. He said that Oswald Rosler, Roess of the Deutsche Bank, Karl Goetz of the Dresdner Bank, and the Krupp board and other key Nazi industrialists like Hermann Göring's brother, had been arrested as anti-Nazi resistance leaders before Hitler's fall. Dulles was wrong on almost every single thing he said. It was true that by late 1944, many Berlin bankers were disillusioned with Hitler, but they were never violently anti-Nazi. Rosler, Goetz, and Göring were never in any sense an anti-Nazi resistance leader. Each had made their careers with the Nazi Party and in bed with the SS. Dulles' recently declassified OSS telegram shows that his principal sources of information on the German financial and industrial elites were officials at none other than the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, which had worked closely with all of the Berlin banks, because remember that every time Hitler took another country, he picked up the phone and told the Bank of International Settlements to transfer that company's gold to the German ledger. The Bank of International Settlements had played along with every aspect of the Axis stealing of other countries' gold to the T. And of course, the guy that was there was a colleague of Alan Dulles. So this is just a very small group of people all playing games in order to save the Nazis and their corporate benefactors. The Dulles family had played an important role in the bank from its inception, so it was not surprising that Alan Dulles would turn his contacts there. The institution had been founded to carry out international clearing necessary for reparation programs that John Foster Dulles had set up after World War I. And the banker's first and most enthusiastic supporter was his sister, Eleanor Lansing Dulles. And remember, Eleanor is the person that was in charge of the State Department office when her brother becomes Secretary of State and Alan Dulles becomes the CIA. She was the belly button in the State Department that coordinated all of the State Department with the CIA. 3 peas in a pod. Both Alan and John Foster Dulles sat on the boards of New York and London affiliates of European companies led by men on the BIS board of directors. And an American with a long social and business tie to the Dulleses, Thomas McKittrick, became the bank president in the 1940s. That's the guy that was moving all of the other countries' gold into Germany's kitty. At least 2 senior Bank of International Settlement officers, McKittrick and Roger Auboyne, worked for Dulles as underground contract agents. McKittrick was agent number 644 on Dulles's payroll. So let that sink in for just a second. The guy at the Bank of International Settlements is on Alan Dulles's payroll. And then Alan Dulles asked him to produce documents that clears all the people in Germany that he wants cleared, irregardless of whether they were doing business with the Nazis. Everybody keeping up? It's so crazy. He had provided regular information and services to the OSS station in Bern throughout the time Alan Dulles was there. Roger Auboyne, the general manager at the Bank of International Settlements, was agent number 651, codenamed General Manager B, and Dulles's messages back to OSS headquarters. Notwithstanding the fact that McKittrick was its president, the BIS was thoroughly dominated by Axis interests due to banks' bylaws that allocated votes on bank policy according to financial contributions. The Axis powers had controlled the BIS votes throughout the 1930s, and as the Blitzkrieg progressed, control of more voting powers fell into the German hands because they kept conquering more countries. They controlled more votes the more countries they acquired. Officially, the BIS was neutral, but they were not neutral at all. During McKittrick's presidency, the BIS cooperated with the German Reichsbank efforts to launder all of the gold stolen from everybody that they imprisoned. The German finance minister, Walther Funk, was first among equals at the BIS wartime board of directors. After the war, McKittrick sold the concentration camp gold back to the Germans, stating, as the New York Times put it, that the Bank of International Settlements had purchased it inadvertently. The institution also joined in a complex Nazi scheme to use currency manipulation and bank clearing procedures to loot the economies of the acquired countries. It led to charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity against the Germans involved in the scheme. McKittrick and other Bank of International Settlement executives, however, were never charged. The bank clearing schemes deserve special notice because their significant but little known role of looting the equivalent of billions of dollars from the Nazi occupied territories. Importantly, this form of looting was for the most part organized and managed by ordinary German corporate executives. You know, the ones they just wrote notes on to clear, those guys. But also foreign collaborators, not just diehard Nazis. Here again, the Nazis succeeded in harnessing the in-place conventional social machinery of trade to the task of a Hitler's government. In this way, billions of Reichsmarks worth of wealth in the countries occupied by Nazis shifted into German hands, often before the victimized country even understood what was happening. Germany had instituted basic monetary clearing procedures during the 1930s as a means of controlling the flow of foreign currency in and out of the Reich. In the simplest form, a German company interested in trade with, say, Belgium, would pay for the Belgian goods in German currency to a German central bank. The Reichsbank in Berlin, that was their central bank. The Reichsbank would then send what amounted to an international IOU to the Belgium Central Bank for the amount that it would pay the German company. The Belgium Central Bank would then pay the Belgium company the money for its good in Belgium currency. Hundreds of other companies in many countries were involved in these deals. Then at a regular interval, the central bank would meet with the Bank of International Settlement, total up the credits and debits of all the business deals and clear them, making a settlement between the central bank that balanced their accounts. The creation of this central channel of foreign exchange permitted Hitler's government to monitor and license all transactions between Germans and foreigners. These procedures contributed significantly to the taking of Jewish property because they closed off the opportunity to transfer assets abroad for all but a few of the wealthiest and best connected people, to include some of the elite German Jews, which they allowed to then use the system. During Germany's wartime occupation of foreign countries, Hitler's government took effective control of both sides of the clearing operation, thus manipulating each contract to the betterment of the German bankers and industrialists. In Belgium, for example, the German occupation government declared the German currency, the Reichsmark, to be worth 12.5 Belgian francs. This rate overvalued the mark by as much as 50%, making everything in Belgium extraordinarily cheap for Germans. Next, the puppet Belgium government decreed that all trade with Germany or with an occupation government was required to use a special currency designed for German use in the occupied countries. In effect, Germany created a new type of money in Belgium and throughout occupied territory in Europe that it could print and spend at will. When it came time to settle up between the Reichsbank and the foreign central bank, the Reichsbank again enlisted the cooperation of the Bank of International Settlements in putting forward a variety of pretexts not to pay the debt. The occupied country was powerless to protest because it was being ran by Germany. The Germans confiscated property in the occupied territories by using a related technique. In Belgium, the Nazi-appointed government forced Jewish people to sell most of their possessions for a price set by the government and paid in the new currency into a special bank account. Later, when most Belgian Jews were deported to be murdered, the occupation government simply seized that account and took everything in it. The German banks and companies began buying up foreign companies, real estate, products, and raw material all across Europe for a fraction of its value. Such transactions were usually completed, quote unquote, legally with actual contracts and deeds. Meanwhile, they were using this Ponzi scheme of money in order to document it. This was extremely profitable for German companies. Now you know why Alan Dulles is involved in deciding which companies benefit and which ones don't. The post-war coalition government in Poland estimated that this type of theft had cost the country the equivalent in 1939 dollars of $20 billion. While these numbers are an estimate, the government obviously had an interest in claiming high damages, but it was a lot. The British estimated that the Germans had extracted the equivalent of $180 billion from occupied Europe as of 1943, including direct levies for occupation costs and a variety of hidden techniques that they used to manipulate currency. They do not include estimates for wealth seized from the Soviet Union and Greece. As such, even the $180 billion underestimates the total theft. The Bank of International Settlements cooperated in facilitating all of this. The bank recognized the Nazi-installed occupation governments, provided the clearing services essential to legalizing the operation, and even went so far as to help Nazi leaders such as Walther Funk unload looted gold in the international market. Once the war was over, Alan Dulles and the OSS turned to McKittrick, Auboyne, the Bank of International Settlement, and to Dulles's own pre-war business contacts in Germany for advice on the political leanings of German bankers. This was an obvious, indefensible move. The prejudice latent in McKittrick's recommendation to Dulles should have been sorted out by Dulles himself, but as we know, Dulles and his brother were instrumental in setting these companies up to begin with. Dulles passed on McKittrick's evaluation of German bankers with only minimal checking. In the summer of 1945, Dulles prepared a list of 8 top German bankers, complete with biographies, whom he recommended on the basis of their ability and their record for senior corporate posts in German major enterprises. Dulles drew heavily on the protégés of Heinrich Schlott, who was basically known as Hitler's central banker at one point, then already facing charges before the military tribunal at Nuremberg, but of course, they made sure he got off. At the top of Dulles's list was Ernst Hulse, Hulse, a former director of the Bank of International Settlement and a key Schlott aide at Reichsbank. Next came Karl Blessing, also a former Reichsbank director, Bank of International Settlement director, and another protege of Heinrich Schlott. And then a series of minor bankers, some of who had, in fact, been hostile to some of the Nazi actions. The men Dulles recommended usually ended up in very senior positions in Germany. A closer look at Karl Blessing's career illustrates not only the ambiguity of the German financial elite under Hitler, but also the role of U.S. intelligence in preserving that elite through 1945 and 46. With Alan Dulles's help, Karl Blessing cultivated a reputation after the war as an anti-Nazi who had once resigned a seat on a board of a powerful multinational company, Unilever, rather than cooperate with SS efforts to take over the company. Following the quote-unquote act of bravery, Blessing later told the New York Times he was reassigned by Hitler to be a functionary at the Ministry of Mineral Oil Industry, where he spent years hiding from the Gestapo. This claim was remarkable both in that Blessing should make it and that the Times actually printed it. The truth is that Blessing served throughout Hitler's years as one of the most important liaisons between Germany's big business and the Nazi Party, as well as the SS. Karl Blessing represented Himmler Schlott and the Reichsbank at meetings, clandestine organizations of bankers and industrialists who sought to curry favor with the SS chief Himmler. By secretly bankrolling some of his most exotic projects, Hitler was one of them. Blessing was among the most enthusiastic attendees at Himmler's gatherings for more than a decade. And that came from a guy by the name of Fritz Kranzfuss, who became Himmler's adjutant and monitored all of these meetings. Blessing participated in 30 out of 38 gatherings. So he wasn't an outsider. Blessing also joined various Nazi-sponsored businessmen and other organizations as early as 1934, and then he joined the Nazi Party in 1937. Schlott had appointed him the youngest full director of the Reichsbank in the entire history of the bank. He engineered Karl Blessing's appointment to several private banking posts and a directorate at Margarine Union AG, the German branch of Unilever. Blessing served as the financial director in Berlin between 39 and 41, a post that was roughly the equivalent to the German government appointed trustee of a company and its property. It was considered to be highly visible, but it also had been deemed a criminal corporate enterprise. He never was the lowly clerk that he told people that he was. The Continental OL was for the strategically crucial petroleum industry, which Hermann Göring combined was to Germany's weapons production, a government licensed monopoly used by the Nazis to seize control of hundreds of companies by German troops, especially along the Eastern Front. Under Blessing's leadership, this Continental became the German corporation of like a prototype of the German corporation under Hitler. Throughout the 30s, German oil production had been coordinated through the state ministry in a private cartel, and the main German companies in the industry had remained privately owned, but were managed by people like Blessing. Continental was the solution. The four largest German oil companies and IG Farben jointly created Conti, Konti, as a new petroleum monopoly for Eastern Europe. The company enjoyed Germany's government sponsorship, exclusive production contracts, and first claim on any petroleum-related properties that were made available that they stole from the Jewish people or from foreign people as they invaded their countries. The corporation paid 7.5% royalty on petroleum to the Reich. All remaining profits of the operations were divided among the companies that were bankrolling it. They became the largest single exploiter of concentration camp labor in history. According to the International Red Cross records, Conti and the network of subsidiary companies maintained their own concentration camps and they list them. There's like 15 different locations. It is quite likely that there were other Conti operations in Poland and Ukraine. The prisoners did crushing construction labor needed to reopen roads and oil fields that had been destroyed by the Soviet Union. They also laid pipelines and created new petroleum sites. Conti leased most of his personnel from the SS. concentration camps. And one, it was entered into evidence in Nuremberg, quote, Jewish laborers would not receive any payment in cash, unquote. The factory administration will pay the SS and the German police for each person based on the number of days that they work. The system was orderly enough. Payments for inmates were to be delivered to the SS the third day of each month. So they had an incentive to find more bodies for the labor camps. No one knows how many inmates died working at Conti, though hard labor camps of this type typically killed a third to half of its inmates every 6 months. The SS spokesman at the conference contended that construction work on the Eastern Front should become one of the main vehicles for wiping out every prisoner. Karl Blessing exercised special responsibility for the company's financial affairs and its relation with the German banks. He could hardly have been ignorant to the character of the company that he was leading. He could not be ignorant to the money that was being paid to the SS that allowed them to consistently refurbish their labor force. Even Conti's corporate offices in Berlin, where Blessing worked, were built with concentration camp labor. Much of this was known as early as the summer of 1945. Blessing's service as a director was widely noted in German biographies, dictionaries, business magazines, and the like. Details of Conti's activities in the East were not quite as extensively written about, but everyone knew what was happening. Two of Blessing's colleagues from the Conti's board, Walther Funk of the Reichsbank and BIS, and Heinrich Bodewisch of IG Farben, were even about to be put on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanities. Nonetheless, with Allen Dulles' assistance, new respectability seemed to sparkle for Karl Blessing from the summer of 1945 as he continued to climb the corporate structure in what was going to be the new Germany. Dulles' de facto clearance became instrumental in Blessing's return to a variety of German businesses on their advisory boards, in corporate directorships. He was even put back on the board of Unilever, where he eventually served as the company's international board of directors and as chairman of the German subsidiary. Blessing became one of the highest paid business executives in the world. Fortune magazine gushed after the war with an annual salary equivalent to about $75,000 back in 1940s. Blessing then stepped up and became chairman of West Germany's central bank. And by the early 1960s, he was by any measure among the most powerful men in Germany. By the time he retired in 1970, Karl Blessing had emerged in his own stories and in the press as virtually an anti-Nazi resistant hero. The prestige media in the US and Europe seemed to have convinced themselves that a man of sensibility, respect, and well-dressed as Blessing just could never have been a Nazi or Nazi sympathizer. The heart of the matter is that Karl Blessing was willing to traffic in the lives of concentration camp inmates in order to maintain his corporate position and social status in Nazi Germany and then lie about it afterwards. By any reasonable standard, this decision made Blessing an accomplice to crimes against humanities. The members of the corporate board of IG Farben was eventually tried and convicted for procuring slave labor for construction of IG Farben's oil facilities. Yet Blessing managed to escape any of that, even though he was on the IG Farben board, mainly thanks to Allen Dulles' intervention in the McKittrick's documents saying that he was anti-Nazi. Okay, so they're still fighting back in the State Department about what's going to be a war crime and what isn't. This infighting became particularly pronounced in prosecutions of the German industrial elites and the business leaders. Nuremberg. So while the U.S. team at Nuremberg was prosecuting Blessing's longtime mentor, Heimer Slatz, for example, the legal advisor's office at the State Department was quietly helping the defense team clear him. In the heart of the prosecution argument was that Slat had been instrumental in bringing Hitler to power, in providing legitimacy and stability to his regime as his economic advisor, in the clandestine rearmament of Germany, and also in the attack on Jewish people. Slat also served the Nazi regime as a Reichsbank director and minister of economics. He had participated in the Nazi conspiracy to use slave labor. Meanwhile, the State Department helped drum up support for his defense by tracking down witnesses and interviewing U.S. intelligence agencies and assets who might have evidence that reflected favorably on the banker. An argument can be made that the State Department had an obligation to provide any evidence that they had, but they went way beyond that. They went looking for people to try to find a defense for this guy. State's legal advisor, Hackworth, went well above any ordinary steps. Hackworth sought out new defense witnesses, screened them, arranged transportation and scheduling for them, and became a behind-the-scenes advocate for Slat. The state dispatched messages seeking support for him to the U.S. consul in Zurich, Sam Woods, long one of the most important U.S. back channel conduits to the German economic elite, and to Hans Jessevis, a leader of a tiny nationalist conservative wing of the German resistance, who had been an important member of Allen Dulles' intelligence network. Jessevis was still working as a full-time U.S. intelligence source in 1945. Both he and Woods proved eager to work on Slat's behalf. The State Department engaged another Dulles agent, the former Axis Romanian ambassador, Gagori Gafențu, to write memoirs that stressed that Germany had been drawn into the war against its will, and that choices of people like Slat as a result of that weren't their fault. Meanwhile, Robert Jackson's prosecutors at Nuremberg was still split over the issue of whether to bring him to trial. The U.S. hardliners favored prosecution, as did Jackson, but Jackson's most senior deputy, former SS chief William Donovan, strongly opposed the trial. Donovan argued that Slat had been secretly sympathetic to Western allies in the war, and that a tough cross-examination of him on the witness stand would undermine the stability of Germany and our national security. Jackson, however, found himself hemmed in by his commitments to France and the Soviet prosecutors, who strongly favored putting him on trial. Donovan then resigned over this dispute. Donovan felt so strongly that Heimler Slat should not be put on trial at Nuremberg, even though he was key financially to making all of this stuff with the Bank of International Settlements and this fake money that they were using and all that crap. He was critical to all of that setting up. And while Bill Donovan said that if you try him, I'm going to quit, and he quit because he got tried. And he really did it over nothing, because they weren't, there's no way they're going to find him guilty. Okay. But while Bill Donovan did work behind the scenes to make sure that the prosecutors that actually did the cross examination did so in a very strict manner, Jackson's eventual agreement to the limitation took the heart out of what you could have actually charged him as far as crimes. So therefore, Slat was acquitted at Nuremberg and over the protest of the Soviet judge. In this case, as in others, the split between the US and the Soviets kept getting bigger. It all boiled down to basically more about politics than it did about people's innocence or guilt. The Western intellectuals looked east during the Cold War. They found several examples of communist states employing ideological and rhetoric to separate the Soviet government from its more odious activities. Stalin never publicly discussed mass murder, Western scholars pointed out. He spoke instead of class struggle and of eliminating certain people of certain classes, and in doing so, diffused his responsibility for their fate. The fact that Western press indulged in similar historical revisionism concerning the Nazis, while at the same time hammering the Soviets, was illustrative of this double standard. It also suggested that the Western media engaged in self-delusions about mass crimes, sometimes, well documented in the Axis side of the war. How would it be possible for the New York Times and Fortune magazine to write about Conti's wartime businesses without considering the most of the company's assets had been looted from the countries that Hitler occupied? The discussion of Conti apart from these facts was basically ignorant, yet it was done. Karl Blessing's complicity in genocide was not as direct as that of SS generals who led the extermination squads, but he was basically, he was knowledgeable about all of it and did nothing to stop it. Those traits enabled him to prosper as a young executive under Hitler, his tolerance of all of this. They brought him to Slat's attention and put him in contact with that entire network. His counterparts at the Bank for International Settlements and the Western foreign policy and financial circles was all part of his grooming. The Allied leaders who were struggling with the day-to-day problems of managing Germany would once again turn to Karl Blessing. So not only do they save him, Alan Dulles, from going to Nuremberg, he is then thrust into the center of what's going to happen to Germany post-war. Just as with the Smith brothers, the basic question remained: under what circumstances does offering amnesty to Nazis, such as Blessing, to avoid a greater evil, supposedly what we were avoiding is this imminent attack by the Soviets, despite the fact that they had lost 25 million people, and we had already been told by State Department's own admission that they were in no position to do anything in the immediate aftermath of the war. Robert Murphy and Alan Dulles believed that they knew the answer. The decision should be left to the competent government authorities operating in a framework that was set out by them. Murphy and Dulles repeatedly reached secret verdicts that they believed necessary to construct the post-war Germany. As early as the summer of 1945, Murphy was willing to defy U.S. treaty obligations concerning high-ranking Nazis and Axis collaborators when he regarded it was in the U.S. interest to do so. Shortly after the German collapse, for example, Tito's government in Yugoslavia wished to try the war criminal Miklos Horthy. who had been a royal regent of Hungary and supreme commander of the Hungarian armed forces during the years of alliance with the Nazi Germany. Horthy also shared personal responsibility for establishing the Hungarian race laws and the persecution of Hungarian citizens. The Yugoslavs had suffered invasion and massacre at Hungary's hand during Horthy's regime, and they felt justified in bringing formal charges against him at the War Crimes Tribunal. According to their agreements with the US, they seem to have legal authority to prosecute him even in a Yugoslav court. The post war Czechoslovakia government of Jan Maastricht agreed that the Czech cabinet on September 25th, 1945, declared the ex-regent Horthy a war criminal. President Maastricht took a serious view of Horthy's activities, characterizing them as aggression and an invasion of Czechoslovakia, persecution, responsible for cruelties, ill treatment, and executions of Czech citizens, destruction of property, and forcing Czech citizens into the Hungarian army. According to U.S. diplomatic report, the Czechoslovakians also brought charges against Horthy. But Horthy, as will be seen, was not an ordinary war criminal. Horthy had led the establishment of a Catholic monarchist state in Hungary after suppression of the communist rebellion in Budapest in 1919. The U.S. aid to shore up his wobbly government had been the centerpiece of Allen Dulles' recommendations to President Woodrow Wilson during the young diplomat's days as chief of the U.S. political intelligence for Central Europe. Horthy had emerged as something like a grand old man of Hungary during the interwar years. He was well liked in Washington because he was controlled by Washington. They convinced themselves that Horthy had been, quote unquote, forced to join the Axis. Horthy had always been a militarist in the mold of a Spain's Franco or Portuguese Salazar. In other words, he's a fascist. He preferred political and economic persecution to outright murder. At least usually, Hitler had grown worried about Horthy's loyalty to him, so the Germans deposed him, installed a more compliant regime, and swept away hundreds of thousands of Hungarians to death camps. The U.S. Army captured Horthy during the summer of 1945 and interned him at Ashcan, the U.S. POW camp for high-ranking Axis prisoners. Within weeks after his arrival, U.S. political advisor Murphy sought Washington's approval for Horthy's release. Legal advisors Green Hackworth agreed, provided the Soviet Union did not formally object. The Soviets said nothing. Murphy wished to offer Horthy political asylum and protection from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation in establishing a post-war Hungarian regime sympathetic to the U.S. In other words, he was controlled by America. The U.S. ambassador to Budapest, Rudolf Schoenfeld, believed that Hungary's post-war government in 1945 would secretly agree to this, providing that it did not do so publicly. The post-war coalition government of Hungary did not want to try Horthy for treason if it was impossible to avoid doing so. So according to the U.S. Embassy reports of the day, because many felt a trial would undermine the state's future, the chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, promised Horthy that if he cooperated with the U.S. political agenda, the U.S. would block any war crime charges against him and refuse to transfer him to Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia. Horthy agreed. Jackson then met with the Czechoslovakian and Yugoslavia war crimes officials, telling them that it would sit rather badly with the world if these countries tried the regent, owing to Horthy's advanced age, because he was over 70. In fact, Jackson knew that the U.S. doctors had examined Horthy and found him to be fine. He lived for more than 20 more years. Jackson offered the Yugoslavs a confidential deal under which Horthy would be formally charged with war crimes but not actually turned over to Yugoslavia for trial. The Yugoslavs rejected the overture, insisting that Horthy had to be transferred to Belgrade and he had to be put on trial. The War Crimes Commission, the new U.S. representative to that, was Colonel Joseph Hodgson. He sought to derail the Horthy prosecution when consideration of the case came up a few weeks later at the committee. They deadlocked over the case, split between Yugoslav and Czechoslovakia on one side and the U.S. and Brits on the other. They eventually compromised on charging Horthy with crimes against humanity, the most morally compelling but legally weak way to go. The adjourned the war crimes charges stemming from the Hungarian invasion of its neighbors. This action satisfied the Czechs, who refrained from further requests to have him put on trial, but the Yugoslavs would not give up. The U.S. military authorities in Germany, meanwhile, released Horthy from Ashcan, and he took up residence in Bavaria. Officially, the former regent was supposed to notify U.S. authorities if he moved. But other than that, he was free to do as he chose. Robert Murphy and the U.S. ambassador to Hungary worked to clear Horthy's petition for permission to immigrate to Switzerland or Portugal, both of which were willing to provide him with asylum. The U.S. State Department succeeded in protecting Horthy from trial on any charges, including crimes against humanity. Even though the U.S. had itself supported such charges, they decided to renege on that. Imagine that. Some senior U.S. officials even made sure that Horthy was invited to U.S. diplomatic receptions in Germany during this time. Less than 2 years after the fall of Berlin, the Yugoslav government formally protested to Washington after noticing a news dispatch from Munich describing the wedding of U.S. Consul Sam Woods. The published invitation including a dozen senior officials, including Horthy. The Yugoslav ambassador has the honor to draw the attention of the Honorable U.S. Secretary of State to the fact that Admiral Horthy is a war criminal, the protest read. Horthy had been registered by the Yugoslav War Crimes Commission, and he even cited the page and paragraph number. The Yugoslav government requested the American authorities at Wiesbaden for extradition of the admiral and repeated this request again in 1946. The Yugoslav wanted to know what disciplinary action was planned against Woods for consorting with Horthy, a war criminal. The U.S. responded stiffly that the wedding was a private nature and there wasn't anything they could do about it. The more sophisticated Axis defendants soon learned how to make the most out of the division among the Allies. The post-war careers of SS men who had negotiated with Allen Dulles during Operation Sunrise provided an example of the relationship that evolved into who got saved and who didn't. After the German surrender, SS General Karl Wolff proceeded on the assumption that Wolff's cooperation with Dulles had won him a place in post-war German government. Wolff sought to pick up the political threads of his old command, an OSS report said, playing on the old discrepancy between Russia and America, meaning, hey, Russia's going to come across and kill all of you, we'll help you. Though Dulles was later to deny it, he extended a de facto protection to Karl Wolff and at least two of his assistants, Eugene Dahlmann and Eugene Winter, both of whom were later indicted by Italian authorities for their roles in massacres of Italian partisans and the deportation of Italian citizens to Auschwitz. Circumstantial evidence links Dulles to the escape of another Wolff assistant, Walter Roth. whose rise through the SS ranks had been helped by his use of the gas trucks to murder people as a mobile death camp. Allied war crimes investigators identified Wolf almost immediately as one of the most powerful members of the Nazi inner circle to survive the war. The French and Soviet governments favored prosecuting him to be one of the first trials at Nuremberg. Had Wolf been tried there, he would almost have certainly been sentenced to hang. But the US and British representatives at Nuremberg Planning Committee said no. Only one SS officer was prosecuted there. The others would surely get their turn later. Later never came. The case against Gestapo chief Ernst Kaltenbrunner would be easier to make than against Wolf, the US contended, even though Wolf probably had more power in the SS than anyone else. After much debate, the Tribunal Planning Committee decided to prosecute Kaltenbrunner first, and in the autumn of 1945, they slated Wolf to be the chief SS defendant at the second tribunal scheduled to open in 1946. But that was not to be. Within weeks of the opening of the first, Robert Jackson recommended to Washington that the U.S. should not cooperate in any further trials, regardless of its commitment to Moscow. The state-to-state relations began deteriorating almost immediately. Jackson believed that the Soviet vision of justice in Europe required revolutionary reorganization of Germany and a rapid expansion of Soviet power. Any new international trial of Nazi leaders would certainly provide the Soviet Union with political gains. It had nothing to do with justice. It may give them a bone, and we don't want to make the Soviets look good. So they're advocating for justice. We're not. And if we give them justice, that's going to make them look good. Instead, Jackson convinced Truman the U.S. should hold its own trials of Nazi defendants, then in U.S. hands. These trials became known later as the later Nuremberg trials, or more formally as subsequent proceedings. These later trials, prosecuted under the command of General Telford Taylor, proved to be one of the most comprehensive efforts to prosecute anyone. Taylor and his colleagues brought more than 180 individual German leaders to justice and created a permanent record of Nazi criminality. The subsequent proceedings included 3 major prosecutions of SS defendants, one of Germany's justice ministries, one of Nazi doctor that had been active in the concentration camp, and 3 senior German military commanders, 3 major German industrialists, and 1 trial of 21 leaders of various ministries. Karl Wolf again succeeded in wriggling off the hook, despite the fact that he was personally implicated in half of the cases that were brought to trial. Meanwhile, Wolf's top SS aide, who had been active in Sunrise, Walter Roth, Eugene Dolman, and Eugene Winner, and others also escaped prosecution, even though they were charged with crimes against humanity and other charges by Italian officials. Allen Dulles and his colleagues in the U.S. clandestine operations could not order Telford Taylor or the Italian government not to prosecute them. He lacked authority to do so. Considering the strong personal commitment of Telford Taylor and his aides to the war crimes trials, any obvious attempt to derail them would have been a step too far. But Dulles and the emerging CIA could nonetheless make their influence felt directly and indirectly, even after Dulles had left his OSS post. In the fall of 1946, the Italian government issued arrest warrants for SS officers and Gestapo officers that had operated in Italy, including Wolf and his senior assistants. That triggered inquiries from the State Department to the U.S. Central Intelligence Group, which is what the OSS had turned into, CIG, concerning what should be done with these people that were still in U.S. custody. The CIG was the predecessor to the CIA and had administrative responsibility for U.S. intelligence affairs between the time of the OSS and the creation of the CIA. The CIG liaison officer with state, Robert Joyce, prepared a reply that in time became the standard language used to explain the U.S. commitment to the USS Men. So let me explain something here. In a normal world, the Central Intelligence Agency would have zero to do with whether or not the Italians charged anybody or whether or not the US did. That would be strictly the Department of Justice and the State Department. The Central Intelligence has nothing to do with that, period. What this did for me is it illustrated that Alan Dulles was using these Nazis to set up Gladio. The use of the Central Intelligence and the OSS at the end of the war to protect Nazis. And all of these Nazis end up incorporated into NATO, the B&D, the CIA, and Gladio overall. What you are reading here, and that's why I found this so profound. At no time in the world's history would you pick up the phone and involve the CIA in something that had to do with a judicial issue if you were actually interested in justice, because they don't play a role in it at all. The only thing that you may want to do is call them up and say, hey, is this one of your sources? And had that phone call been made, which I'm alleging that it has, and they go, yeah, we're going to use them, or we are using them, or we have been using them, then only then would there be a hands-off policy, which is exactly what happened. So we know that was true. Hopefully you followed that logic. All right. So here's what was found in a document. The records of the former OSS provide proof that Eugenio Dolman, aide to General Wolf, and former SS Führer, as well as former SS Eugene Winter, also connected with Wolf, and now being held captive in Italy, participated in the operation leading up to the German capitulation in Italy. Mr. Alan Dulles, formerly of OSS and later SSU, a short-lived iteration of OSS, initiated the negotiations, has been contacted here and confirms the foregoing. Major General Lyman Lemetsker, who also participated in these negotiations, is convinced, after an examination of the records and contact with Alan Dulles, of Dolman's participation, presents representation by the Italians would appear to be an endeavor to undermine in Italy the Allied position. It would appear the Allied interest would be advanced by the U.S. military headquarters and would confirm the fact that Dolman and Winter's participation and that these people should receive consideration appropriate to the circumstances. So, what Alan Dulles did with Operation Sunrise is basically plant the beginning of the interaction between Reinhard Gehlen and Alan Dulles and the setting up of European stay-behind network through NATO right there. And the fact that Lyman Lemetsker was at that meeting and later issues Operation Northwood that recommends domestic terror attacks in the United States, camouflaged as Castro's army to kill Americans in order to justify a full-scale army invasion of Cuba. And ends up at NATO headquarters, who runs Operation Gladio at the very same time JFK is assassinated. He was at the first planning meeting of Operation Gladio. That's what this book just said. My mind was blown when I read that. So, going on. Italian authorities also tightened screws on Walter Roth, whom the Americans were then holding at a relatively high security prison. Roth, Rauff, had been one of Wolfe's most important links to Cardinal Schuster and Monsignor Besrari throughout the negotiations with Dulles back during Sunrise. When the Italians sought to prosecute Roth for his work with the Gestapo in Milan, the U.S. authorities transferred him to a prisoner hospital in Milan, and from there to a low-security POW camp near Rimini that had seen a series of, weirdly enough, prison escapes. And then, weirdly enough, he walked away and escaped. He said later, I went to Naples when he was questioned at a Chilean immigration court, which means he went to Chile as a Nazi, where colony dignity is. That had lots of other Nazis there. He goes on to say, there was a Catholic priest that helped me go to Rome. Another rat line from the prison at Rimini to Rome and on to Chile. He said that he stayed overnight in lots of convents, courtesy of the Holy See. There was a Catholic priest helped me, and with the help of the Catholic Church, my family was able to come with me. Isn't that nice? That family togetherness. Reunited with his family, he went to Damascus. And from there to South America, eventually to Chile. With Roth's hidden by the Vatican and Wolfe in U.S. hands in Germany, Italian officials renewed their efforts to prosecute Dolman, Winter, and a handful of other SS officers that they still believed was in U.S. custody. An Italian military tribunal in Rome filed charges against Dolman and 3 others on November 25th, alleging that they had been instrumental in mass executions of civilian hostages. The U.S. then takes Dolman from his internment center, where the Italian prosecutors knew he was being held, to an army hospital. But that would only work temporarily. And by the following spring, the U.S. Army Command in Italy was complaining to the State Department and to the Interim Central Intelligence Group of the necessity for a decision on what the hell to do with Dolman. After a flurry of cables back and forth and discussions, the records of which are still classified. Tell me why. 70-some years? We don't need to know? The State Department determined that both Dolman and Winter will be removed to Germany under security arrangements as soon as EUCOM, European Command, and the U.S. military could confirm that they'll accept them. The U.S. shipped Dolman immediately. Once Wolfe, Dolman, and Winter were safely beyond the reach of Italian law, they renewed their appeal for a complete amnesty from the war crimes prosecution. SS General Karl Wolfe claims that in connection with Operation Sunrise, leading to the surrender of German forces in Italy, that had been a promise of none other than Allen Dulles. Wolfe alleges Major Weibel of the Swiss General Staff was witness to the guarantees made by Allen Dulles. Some U.S. intelligence authorities in Germany are of the definite opinion that the military honor requires pardon and immunity for Wolfe and his adjutants, who are at present in automatic arrest category. Can you make discreet inquiries of Dulles and others concerning the nature of possible promises? They wrote. Dulles, Major General Lyman Leminsker, and the intelligence group assistant director, Colonel Galloway, again intervened to assist the SS men. According to U.S. records, Galloway told the State Department Security Chief Jack Neal that the Wolf Group rendered services to the Allies and therefore they were under an obligation to not surrender them. But his claims on this point had begun to wear thin, considering the sworn testimony of 4 SS officers that he had made these promises had now been corroborated by affidavits because they were basically denying they said it, by Max Hussman and Max Weibel, both of whom were widely reputed to be senior employees of the Swiss intelligence service that had been at the meeting. Jack Neal at State said he could smell the potential trouble of an increasingly messy affair. After talking to Galloway at the, at the intelligence group, Neal wrote a memo for file, pinning responsibility for his actions on Dulles and the intelligence group, when wired back to Murphy at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin that the State Department had concluded that Allies owed an obligation to Wolf, Dolman, and the other SS that had been involved in Sunrise. Therefore, he said in a top secret cable, definite consideration should be given to favorable aspects of weighing any war crimes in which they've been charged. Wolf's role in organizing the extermination camps and in administering forced labor and the extensive use of the forced labor, regardless of his role in SS Sunrise, were not equal. Dolman and Winter were more junior SS officers, but they faced the same problem. The U.S. government transferred Wolf from an internment camp to considerably more comfortable lodging in a mental hospital and later claimed that he had had a mental breakdown, rendering him incompetent to stand trial. Wolf, nonetheless, became a favored informant of the U.S. prosecution at Nuremberg, because that's what crazy people do, contributing evidence to a number of cases against other SS officers to save his ass. British government prosecutors delivered the coup de grace to the efforts to bring Karl Wolf to justice. They formally requested the U.S. turn over him and his aides to the British for a war criminal trial. But then Telford Taylor's prosecution group was running out of funds and under considerable pressure from the State Department to wrap up activities as quickly as possible because they didn't really want to prosecute anybody else. Taylor readily agreed to transfer Wolf to the British custody, but the British did not try Wolf. Instead, they severed his prosecution from that of the other generals, despite the fact that Wolf's case was considerably more clear-cut and easy to prosecute. They then kept Wolf in protective custody without bringing him to trial until Taylor's war crime unit had gone. In late 1949, the British brought Karl Wolf before a denazification board in Hamburg, a move that might have been fairly compared to charging an SS leader with a traffic violation. Wolf's Sunrise colleagues turned out in force to verify his denazification. Those witnesses included Allen Dulles, Lyman Lemetsker, and General Terence Airy. They each submitted an affidavit on his behalf. Dulles' senior aide, Gero von Javernitz, testified in person as a defense witness. The board deliberately briefly determined that Karl Wolf in the dock was in fact a well-known Nazi and SS leader, and then went on to conclude that the time Wolf had served in internment since the war had been punishment enough, and he was free to walk away. 13 years later, the worldwide public attention to the Eichmann trial spurred German prosecutors to reopen the case on Karl Wolf and his crimes against humanity. But by that time, Allen Dulles had retired from the CIA in the wake of his failed Bay of Pigs, and the rest of the old Sunrise team seemed to prefer avoiding a public trial. German courts convicted Wolf of complicity in the murder of 300,000 Jewish people and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. 15 years for 300,000. He served 7 years before he was once again released. The path of Wolf's aide, Eugene Dolman, followed to freedom remains murky, but new light was shed on his case recently when some of the personal archives of military intelligence agents John Valentin Grombach found their way into public domain in the 1950s. The CIA hired Grombach's private intelligence network at $1 million a year to perform a variety of espionage service in Western and Eastern Europe. But Grombach's relationship with the CIA went sour, and he began compiling hostile intelligence reports on CIA agents that he leaked to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Senator Joseph McCarthy, and other people that didn't like the CIA. Dolman kept in contact with American intelligence after the war. Grombach wrote in a confidential memo to the FBI. Dolman had his entry into Switzerland cleared by the CIA and had began to work for the CIA. Oh, no kidding. Probably, let's see, that's around the same time that Otto Skorzeny is working for the CIA. His work became especially important during the period when General Walter Bedell Smith was the director and Allen Dulles was the deputy director. In November 1952, at the time when Mr. Dulles was in Germany, the whole thing blew up. Grombach noted, German press reports brought to light a series of scandals involving former Nazi officials who favored a Soviet-backed proposal for a neutral Germany. Dolman's role in the affair is not completely clear to this day, but it was certain that he had some connections with the neutralists who were enjoying clandestine support from East Germany. The scandal in turn produced reports of Dolman's association with both the CIA and MI6. Dulles was somewhat abashed by the latest fiasco, Grombach wrote, and left Germany in haste. So he ends up working for the CIA. In time, the Swiss ended up deporting Dolman. Yeah, isn't it weird that he ends up in Switzerland, which is where Allen Dulles hang out all the time, for abuse of his visitor status. No court ever tried Dolman for his role in any of the horrific activity that he was involved in. And on the basis of his memoir, he today enjoys the reputation of being a not so bad guy. Dolman's colleague and prison mate, Eugene Winter, who shared with Dolman the benefits of U.S. intelligence intervention, also appears to have avoided any war crime charges. Common pattern of U.S. treatment of SS men involved in Sunrise negotiations was across the board. As for Walter Roth, he escaped from U.S. custody under this mysterious circumstances with the help of the Catholic Church and made his way. And he was also financially bankrolled by U.S. intelligence. Officially, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union formally agreed at Potsdam during 1945 to a tough program of demilitarization, decentralization, and denazification of Germany. That basically didn't happen. The Wolf and Horthy cases suggest that despite public promises, there was absolutely nothing done of real value in the denazification process. Instead, we just hit a bunch of them all over the world. So, there you have it.
Crazy. Just a crazy story. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Can you remember when we were studying all these Nazis and them coming to the United States? There was one in particular that I actually found lecturing to, he was into training the academy, at the academy.
Was he wasn't he the one that was at National War College, not at an academy? I think it was National War College.
That sounds right. And I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember his name.
Specifically.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just seeing it, but it's amazing.
Honey, we spent 2.5 years tracing Nazis.
Right. Right.
It's hard to keep them all straight.
They're everywhere. It's like roaches, man. As soon as you turn a corner,
there's another Nazi. There's another Nazi.
Right. And they played an active role in our government, not an inactive role. I mean, and this was, well, like we said all along, World War II never ended. It just changed.
It went from an overt war to a covert war overnight.
Amen. And the more research we do, because it is a continuing thing, I'm just convinced of it.
Well, this kind of drove home another nail in the coffin, if you will, of what we already knew, that they were working on setting up the stay behind units before the war was even ended. And Operation Sunrise drives that home. If you read about Operation Sunrise and you know that in the immediate aftermath of that, the taking of Reinhard Gehlen into Washington, D.C. and debriefing on where all of the networks is, Lyman Lemesker's role in the use of Gladio, both in his Northwood paper and then later as the NATO commander, all of that stuff plays into this. And to see him front and center in the setting up of it was just, and also, by the way, his position and the reason why he was available to attend these meetings was he's a 2-star general at this point. He is the logistics chief for Eisenhower at the end of the war in Europe. So he was the guy that was shuffling off both while the war is going on and in the immediate aftermath of the war. He's the guy that was taking all of the excess war material, creating the weapon caches. He's the one that's disposing of all of the supplies. So he's the master of the key when it comes to logistical supply networks. And so it's not coincidental that all of these, to include ones that had been in Nazi territories, end up with NATO-approved supplies. Because you know that they're not going to have NATO supplies in caches that were set up like in Ukraine or Romania, but they all end up with NATO supplies thanks to Lyman Lemesker. He was the logistics chief in the aftermath, at the end of World War II and in the aftermath of World War II as they're setting up Operation Gladio. So I was just flabbergasted. Anyway.
Absolutely.
Anybody else got anything? Everybody else is just as stunned as I was when I read the book. I'm like, what? Yeah, they just set up all the rat lines, put them in places where people can just walk out the back door, hide them in an insane asylum, hide them in a hospital, and then poof, they're gone. What you got, Renee? I see ya.
Yeah, okay. This chapter really brought it home, kind of pulling all the facets together of banking, Vatican, the whole kind of foundation and creation of this plan to spread around the world. I really felt it in this chapter of, the whole Operation Gladio.
Yes.
And the CIA it's like the army for the international syndicate, but you've got to have all connections and all these different other angles.
Yes.
And shame on us because they did a number on the population of the world that we won the war, and the propaganda, was a big lie that, enabled this thing to move forward covertly.
Yeah, but not shame on us. I mean, how would you know? We didn't have mass communication back then. And again, I keep saying that because I sat for 30 years inside of an organization that I thought had the best interest of the American people at its heart. And when you sit in that organization under that pretext, it never crossed my mind, not on 9/11, not during any of the aftermath, never, not when Kosovo kicked off, never in my wildest imaginations would I have ever thought 2 seconds, if anybody would have told me, I would have told them they were crazy, that my government would be going around the world overthrowing governments. I would have not believed it. I would have not believed that there's a secret network that creates terrorists to unleash on their own people. I would not have believed it. I would have looked into it, but I would have not believed whoever was telling me that. And so even the few people back in the day, like Morgenthau and people like that, that were screaming up and down that stuff needed to happen, they're screaming into a void because they're never going to get a voice because they already owned the media. So
right. And then the banking, I mean, it was around this time, right, that the IMF and the BIS was created in.
Well, the BIS was set up after World War I in order to handle the reparations. So that of World War I, that had to be the first step. So they set up the mini UN called the League of Nations just to get the idea floated out there that we're going to have something like that. And they set up the Bank of International Settlements, which is basically the central bank of central banks, under the guise that we have to have it, which they did not. Reparations had happened for a century before that, and you never needed a central bank. But again, you have to have these major catastrophic things in order to justify this, because nobody would have stood for it. So they set up the Bank of International Settlements. Post World War II, they set up the IMF and the World Bank because that's how they're going to commit economic warfare from there forward. And they deal directly with the Bank of International Settlements as a result.
And then the printing of the money thing. The printing of the money thing, I've been thinking a lot of this week. I don't know how the rest of you feel, and I'm not good with the whole banking numbers process in my head. But I think this money printing situation the world is in, if we are able to stop this or get to the root of that, I think, because if you pull the plug on this money printing thing, this whole banking thing, it's going to put everything to a halt. I mean, nobody's going to do jack for an international syndicate member if they're not getting paid. They're
Correct.
not going to do it as a favor.
Correct.
So it seems to me when we all sit there and ponder, what is the root of this? How could we stop it?
The money.
It seems like that's it.
The money. You're absolutely right. It's the money. And that's the reason why in the first 100 days of this Trump administration, he went after the money. USAID is a big source of the money. They're talking about the endowment, taxing the endowments, all of that stuff. They're going after the money all along.
This Rumba guy, and I know he had an organization that some refer to as, quote, the pond, unquote. And I didn't quite, I was a little distracted in that part of the chapter, but let it be said, I want to know what that was. And you mentioned that there seems to have been some discrepancy between, this Rumba guy and some bigwigs in the OSS/CIA, etc. I'm just like wondering, can we identify the essential either bureaucratic costs on the U.S. end, whether it be conflicts between military, conflicts between different factions of the Democratic Party, conflicts between intelligence and the military, and also on the European side, like what is the basis of the difference between the PON and the CIA? If we know that.
Yeah, I'll look into that, and try to come up with. I know what you're talking about, but I'd have to do a little bit more thinking on it. But anyway, anybody else got anything?
You wanted to say something about the recent post?
Oh, yeah. So, I was hoping Illini was going to be here. You guys are awesome. Let me just give you guys a pat on the back. Going out and tagging people and trying to get the word out. Obviously, very humbled that you guys do this on a daily basis, and you're definitely getting the word out. I just saw someone else going to make a video about Operation Gladio, although he called it Project Gladio, which it's not. But whatever. I wish they'd get it right. That one of you guys tagged, what's his name? Steve Baker. Is that his name? I don't want to get his name wrong. In a post, let me see if I can find it real quick. He works for the Blaze, and evidently, the poor guy was caught up in January 6th. And so obviously, you guys wanted to get the information of Operation Gladio to him. And, between him and Illini and a couple of others of you, he spent 45 minutes telling us why he doesn't have time to look into Operation Gladio. And which, as Illini appropriately pointed out, had you just talked to me for 45 minutes, you would know everything you need to know, at least on the surface of what Operation Gladio is. But instead, you're sitting here online telling us why you can't be bothered with it because you have more important things to do when you don't even know what it is. And again, I think for anybody that's involved in January 6th, if you understand the context of these false flags, it obviously is very important to that whole conversation. It explains everything. But whatever. And then one of the other guys said something about, and I knew he was calling us weird, that he just found it weird that that we would think that we knew more than an investigative journalist. Well, if you look at that guy's profile, the only PP he follows is Blaze. So he obviously is a puppet account for the Blaze, which I love, by the way. I don't have anything against the Blaze, but I made a smart ass comment back to him saying, yeah, I guess you guys would think it's weird that we just wanted to reach out and help you find out what's actually behind January 6th, because you've obviously missed the big picture. But, bad on us for trying to help. We'll just go back over here in our little corner and pretend like you don't exist. I didn't say that last part, but anyway, I just want to give you guys kudos for doing what you do, because that's how the word gets out. And that's how we have ended up being mentioned, not we personally, but Operation Gladio has been mentioned on the Tucker Carlson show, the Joe Rogan show, and that's the way it's done. And you guys do a great job doing it. So keep it up. I love it. All right. Anybody else?
Colonel?
Yes.
I watched your last two shows with Alpha this week.
Uh-huh.
And you mentioned Cornelius Vander, and I thought you were going to finish it Vanderbilt, but you said Cornelius Vander Star. And the thing I was thinking right away was that in the 19th century, the early 20th century, we had these two big oligarch families, two big famous families that were involved in shipping. There were the Vanderbilts and the Astors.
Yep.
Okay. And both of them were involved in the China trade.
Yep.
And I think both of them, we know the opium wars were going on. I think both of them were involved in shipping the opium into China. And to do that, if they were getting the opium out of Bengal, which was British at that time, they had to have the permission of the British, which probably, basically means the permission of the Rothschilds. Okay. Now, I don't know for a fact that the Vanderbilts back then were involved in any, really dark stuff, but we know from like the Q drops that, and the paintings of the swimming pool at the bottom of Biltmore and so forth, that there were children. The accusation is that there were children sacrificed there and so forth. And we know that Gloria Vanderbilt took a picture with her two kids. This is also in the Q drops where there's a pagan or satanic altar behind her with somebody being sacrificed, right? And then right after that, her husband died. Okay, so the thought is that she was satanic and that she was basically that picture was kind of a photograph saying, hey, you can kill my kids you can kill my husband if you promote my kids, and then one of them, of course, became Anderson Cooper, who was CIA. Okay, so there's a connection between the intelligence, the satanic stuff, the Vanderbilt family. Okay, so then you start talking about the CV Star guy, and the thing that hit me right away is the Latin word for star is Aster. Okay?
Yep.
We've got Vanderbilt, we've got Vanderstar, and we've got Aster, which means star.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start talking about CV Star, and he's involved in the China trade. He's coming out of Shanghai and all this.
He wasn't involved in China trade per se. He was in an insurance industry. Right. Yeah, but he insured the trade.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he also has the ties to the CIA and all that. So,
correct.
But it just struck me because when you said Vanderstar, I was like, okay, I bet that's a cover identity. That's not his real name. And then you said, no, he's a junior. His father was named that too. And I'm like, oh boy.
Yeah.
So is this a multi-generational cover story?
So I would not say it's a cover story. What I would say is because of the naming traditions of these families that were involved, and trust me, I looked for the better part of 2 weeks to try to tie him, because that was my initial thought of, because just 2 years ago we went and toured all of their we went to North Carolina, we went to Newport, Rhode Island, we went into all of the Vanderbilt houses, just because I wanted to see what they all look like, and whether I got that evil vibe or not. There's definitely an evil vibe there, guys. And so I tried to, because the naming of how they do their names uses the middle name as like the maiden name of the mom or whatever. And so right. I'm still convinced there's a connection there. I've not been able to prove it though. So there's that. But I do want to mention, since you were talking about the shipping, Vanderbilt, although that's obviously a business that they were in, the real shipping magnates in the opium trade were all located in India. The Sassoons, the Tatas, they are the ones, and still today, those guys are multi-billionaire. Well, Sassoon basically is gone, but those companies, and there's one more, there were three that not only did they get rich doing the slave trade, but worked on behalf of British India, pumping all of the Indian opium into China. And that was primarily dominated by the Sassoons, Tatas, and that other family whose name's not coming to me. I just wrote a thread about them. But Cornelius, C.B. Starr, insured those shipments, and that's how he was making money as well. So they were all getting rich off of opium.
Right.
Yeah. It's a crazy story and something you don't find in any history book.
Yeah, and but just the conjunction of those three names, because I read that the Astors, the Astor is a German word and it ends Astor instead of Aster. But I read that the Astor name came from Star because they were basically a pagan family, and that, this isn't in the Wikipedia page or anything, but it's a theory that people have who follow these occult families.
Yeah.
And that the Astor name came from Star, and it's just because but I think that somehow you couldn't have three names like that. C.B. Starr guy, he comes along as like his first job was in the Pacific Mail Company. So he's involved. He was originally involved in that before he had AIG.
Right, and that was very notorious for how you spied on people back then.
Right. So there's that that connection to intelligence too.
Yes.
Back then, and to just sailing the Pacific, which all three families were involved in, and then there's this story about how he supported himself with odd jobs. And I'm starting to get really suspicious of anybody really big and rich who has that in their biography, that they started out working all these odd jobs and then they get really rich. But I don't know. We've seen so many of these tech billionaires today who came out of nowhere, and
I call it the rags to riches story that I don't believe ever.
Right. And I don't think they started that with Silicon Valley.
They did not.
CIA influence out there. I think it started generations ago.
Yeah, they did not.
I think this is some kind of multi-generational thing where the three families' names didn't get that way by accident. It was
correct.
Definitely.
Yeah, and by the way, one of the Astors, I think it was John the Fourth, if I remember, is one of the three major guys that was anti-Fed that went down on the Titanic.
Or the Olympic.
Yeah, or whatever. But yeah, he was killed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that was how they got the Fed and the direct election senators in World War I and all that.
Yep.
So, yeah.
All right. Anybody else got anything else before we close up shop today?
I wouldn't mind piggybacking off what you guys were just talking about with the Astor family and meaning Star. If anybody ever wants to go down do a crazy dig rabbit hole, I was looking into the Mars company, and it seems there's family connections, again, family names, history, lineage, genealogy, that goes back to an Italian family, royal family with an Italian name that is similar to Candida, aka Candy. So I do see the converting of names in these nefarious bloodlines, but it seemed to be that the name Candy is derived from this royal family lineage in Italy, Candida, the House of Candida, I don't know, whatever. But and these people are linked to the Mars Candy line. Interesting enough. Okay, I'll yield there. I just wanted to throw that in.
Okay, there you go. All right. Anybody else? All right. Thanks for being here. I do have a couple of things that I have tagged. I want to get done this weekend. I don't know if I'm going to just pre-record it and play it. or exactly how I'm going to do it. But I found a couple. They're not anything to do. I mean, they're obviously Gladio related, but they're not anything to do with the book. And we'll probably have the book finished the first couple of days of next week. Now, I do want to caution everybody that starting on Thursday, I will be traveling for a month. And we are going to do book reviews. But as you know, in the past, when I travel, depending on whether or not it's a travel day, it can be early or it can be late. We're just going to have to be very flexible on when I do these shows. I am purposely, I'm not just traveling for fun this time. I am going to a very dear friend of mine's change of command ceremony at Fort Hood. He's taking over the 3rd ASOG, the Aviation Special Operations Group. And I'm just totally thrilled. I've been a mentor of his for the last 20 years. Awesome guy. And several of my friends are going to be out there. So there's a chance where there will be 3 or 4 days where I don't do any shows because I'm not going to waste a minute of my time with them on anything else. Not that you guys are a waste. That didn't come out right. But I want to spend the time. I only get to see them once every couple of years. So definitely want to spend the time with them. And then I'll be with my daughter, who's going to be working some of the time. So I will have time to do some shows while we're out there in Austin. And then we'll head back. So just hang with us. And I will let you know probably on Monday what our next book is going to be. So thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate it. Take care. Oh, and have a nice weekend.
Typey.
I know. See you guys later.
Okay, bye.
Take care, everyone.